So let's get back to this question. I'm a good person. Isn't that enough? Well, the short answer is nope. So if any of you are here for the short version, this would be the time to get up and leave. And the longer version is wait, but why? And I have a question for myself, which is why didn't I lean in? I don't really like that term, but it is a good one. Why didn't I lean in earlier and ask, why am I so defensive? Well, the whole idea of being a good person, first of all, what is good? It's a subjective term. So if you have one idea of good and I have another idea of good, how are we going to negotiate that? Whose good is going to determine what's good? Now, if you're my boss, we're going to pretty much have to go with your version of good. And so once power comes into it, once someone has more power to define what's good, that becomes the definition. And my definition of good was not rocking the boat. If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. And so not engaging in conflict was a very important piece of my goodness, as was being charitable. And you're going to see both of these things come up in the course. This is, by the way, what I'm doing today is called a racial autobiography. That's what my book is. Everybody in this room could write a racial autobiography. We all are deeply shaped. Our perspective, our life experiences, our material outcomes, all shaped by race and racism. And I thought my life had nothing to do with it. So one thing about the idea of good or any of the ideas we hold is they live in our individual belief systems. And I found this slide on the internet, and I love it because of this kind of closed circuit loopness, which is the way a belief system operates, meaning we use what we already know to make sense of events, conversations, and people as that happens to us. So we're always using what we already know to make meaning of the world around us. Well, what does this mean if a belief system is full of holes, errors, omissions, flat-out lies? That would mean that the meaning a person could make would be pretty distorted, right? It's a little bit like a really bad rumor. You ever heard someone talked about in a way that's just a really bad rumor? You get to know that person, and you're like, whoa, I can't believe I believed that stuff. But when I believed it, it made perfect sense. So that's what I mean when I say we use what we already know to make sense. So to do a racial autobiography or to stand up here, we have to think about my belief system. Where did my knowledge come from? So this is a picture of me at age 2.5. It's the cover of the book. And don't I look so innocent and excited? And I have no idea what's coming down the pike. So I grew up in Winchester, Massachusetts, which is was almost exclusively, I mean, maybe 3 people of color when I was growing up, an exclusively white town, an affluent town. And 7 years ago, if you had said to me, I look at this picture and all I see is racism, I would have said, you are nuts. And it's comments like that that keep racism alive. That is the problem, talking like that. Again, I might not have said it, but I sure would have thought it. In about half an hour, we're going to take a look at this picture again, and I'm going to invite you to reconsider that. So this is what my life in Winchester looked like. I didn't even have to go to family photo albums. This guy did. So does anyone know whose artwork we're looking at? Norman Rockwell, who was charged with depicting the American life in a Saturday Evening Post. And how convenient for me that my life looked identical to what Norman Rockwell was portraying. So in my white bubble in Winchester, families looked like mine. We all looked like the Norman Rockwell life. If I drove 2 hours north to visit grandparents or cousins, their world looked like Winchester. Everywhere I went, I hopped from white bubble to white bubble, and I would never have said it was white. It was just life. This is America. I was a kid. I'm just trying to make meaning of the world around me. And I am not noticing that everyone is white, so whiteness is becoming completely normalized for me. I did have access to the outside world. look like this. So I was born in 1960. So Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver, The Brady Bunch. These were my TV shows. So in this one, I'm being introduced to some other ideas. Now, white is normal here. So there's nothing contradicting my belief system that it's perfectly typical to have a white family. What else is being normalized in this image? Male dominance, right? Right, a two-parent heterosexual family, right? None of this contradicts anything I know. It completely aligns with my world. So it slips right into my belief system seamlessly that it's perfectly natural. And of course Father knows best. My father did. All the dads went off to work and my mom stayed home. There was somehow I got the understanding that there was an idea that it was more important, that those jobs in downtown Boston were more important than the stay home and take care of the kids job. And my mother and father had a beautiful marriage. It lasted over 50 years until they both passed. My father gave my mother an allowance every week. That was completely typical in that era. And I didn't say, what are you doing? She can make it. It was just normal. So this is the way we make meaning in our childhoods of what is happening around us. So it wasn't just the men on my street. It wasn't just the men in my TV shows. It seemed that white men for all of eternity, and for me, all of eternity meant United States history because that's as far as my history took me for a lot of my life. It seemed that white men were filling all the important spots. So let me point out in the lower right corner, President Barack Obama is missing. He has not been blanked out, but this collage was put together before his time. Let's imagine it's updated and he's there. Can we still agree that through history, white men have predominantly occupied positions of power in this country? So I love white men. I'm married to a white man. I'm the daughter of a white man. And it's not just because of power, but this is not to slam individuals. What we're doing here is we're really looking at massive social structures and systems that we are all living in all the time. And yet they can feel invisible. To me, they felt completely invisible. There were taboo topics in my white bubble. Like race wasn't even a taboo topic because I didn't even know it was something to talk about. But what was mentioned, did anyone else grow up with the phrase, never discuss religion or politics in nice company? Okay, I do notice all those hands are white. So yeah, so you couldn't even begin to touch race or racism without talking about politics or religion because those are the cornerstones. What we did talk about a lot, or there was a lot of language floating around me, was about the level playing field. Did anyone else get the message that America is a level playing field? Yeah. So no one ever sat down and said, Debbie, the playing field is level, but I'm 100% sure I got that message in a lot of ways. What language is out there? What did I hear that led me to the conclusion? Or that led you to the conclusion? Work hard to get ahead. Did I hear the word fairness? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And what happens if you do? You get to reach the American dream that's available for who? Everybody. Think of our founding documents. Life, liberty, justice for who? All. All. Right, all men are created equal. I really did think that man part was a figure of speech. Think about one nation, united under God. Think about sweet land of liberty. I mean, there's a lot of language. How about rugged individual? Did anyone hear that one? Yeah, and so much later in life, I learned the term meritocracy, being the idea that America is a meritocracy where people will succeed or fail on their own individual merit. Now, if that's in my belief system, and I see that white men are achieving, the logical conclusion is that white men must have something really special going on. And if I see black and brown people in subservient positions, living in poorer neighborhoods, the logical conclusion with that belief system, using that belief system as my information processor, the logical conclusion is that somehow those individuals aren't so rugged. They're not doing as well. At which point I have a decision to make. Am I going to be a nasty, bigoted person, or am I going to be a charitable person? And my family was the charitable type. So I developed that kind of an idea. Now, some people say, Debbie, your waking up story is really neat, and I'm glad you're waking up. But I grew up really differently. I wasn't exposed to the same white bubble that you were. And I have to ask, aren't all of us, to some degree, exposed to the idea that some people are more valuable than others? Some people types are more valuable than others. I try very hard to stay away from blaming individuals and thinking about structures and systems. So anyone ever see this picture? Not this exact picture, but something that looks like this. This is the board of directors picture. So in my town, pictures like these were at the library, they were at the bank, they were, I was a country club kid, so they were at the country club. I went to an all-girls school, and there's a picture like this in the lobby. So again, the idea of this is what leadership looks like. And I have a dad and a grandfather who look like that. That felt really good. In the same way Martin Luther King's colorblind dream felt really easy for me to digest. So to this day, if you say, Debbie, close your eyes and picture an investment banker, this is who I picture. Never do I picture these 50 men. Does anybody know who these 50 black bankers are? This story that I'm about to tell you did not get into my book because I learned about it by accident after the book came out when I did a Google search that had the word black and Wall Street in it. This is Black Wall Street. Black Wall Street was a thriving community in the early 1900s of exclusively black Americans, and they had 600 businesses, 21 churches, 21 restaurants, 30 grocery stores, 2 movie theaters, 6 private airplanes, 1 hospital, 1 bank, and its own school system. Pretty impressive, right? It's considered one of the most, at the time, it was one of the most affluent communities in the United States of America. I am a history major from Kenyon College. I have an MBA. I had been spending years, 4 or 5 years of my life doing nothing but studying history of racism in America. And only by an accidental Google search do I come across the history of this. I never learned this history, and I never learned that it had been bombed into extinction by white nationalists. So prior to 9/11, this was considered the largest act of domestic terrorism on United States soil. And I would like to say that I think the displacement of indigenous people would be a close second, if not ahead of that, in terms of terrorism. So this was just stunning to me. Why don't we teach this in our schools? Are we afraid our children will fall apart? Because I will tell you, in my experience, children are much more able to take this information in, deal with their feelings, process with their feelings. It emboldens them to want to do right. And yet the adults often can't handle these conversations. They don't want to go there. My parents passed away before I started waking up white, of natural causes, nothing traumatic there. But what I regret is that I never had the chance to say, what did you know? What didn't you know? But I have a feeling that at least one of my parents might have said, this is better left, unexamined. Let's just forget about this and move on. Because that was a norm in my culture. Might be called denial, sometimes done in a spirit, I think it's better if And I don't agree with that. I think exposing history gives us a better chance to not repeat it. I did know black people existed. I find it interesting that when I watched Gone with the Wind, and I can't quite remember what age I was when I first watched it, but I am sure that I didn't stop and say, I can't believe that 17-year-old girl is chewing out her elder. Think about that. And that was perfectly, I was somehow in my white bubble, somewhere along the line, I had already gotten the idea that it was perfectly natural for a white girl to have a grown black woman waiting on her hand and foot, and it was even okay to scold her. Isn't that interesting? How did that get into my belief system? I have gone back very early trying to figure out what was I exposed to when. And I came across the Babar books that I read. Does anyone know this series, the Babar books? It's a French children's book series. It's translated into English. And I had every single one, the 5 or 6 books in the collection. You know how kids will watch a movie or read a book like hundreds of times, again, again, again? So I am 100% sure that I saw what's on the next page many, many times. Though when I saw it, I actually had no memory of ever having seen it. In this picture, the 2 gray elephants are Babar's cousins, so those would be the protagonists in this scenario. And the African savages have jumped out of the jungle, and they are cannibals. So as a child, I have to think that that was a scary moment for me. I'm reading this book, people are, they're elephants, and all of a sudden, boom, there are these cannibals, savages, and I don't have any real live black or brown neighbors in my life who were doing carpool with or sharing chores with. Can I borrow your shovel? Do you have a cup of sugar? I have no normalized cross-racial relations in my life. So this allows me to file away in my belief system the idea that black and brown people, certainly black people, certainly African people, are dangerous, savage, subhuman. And that sets me up for the rest of my life, unless that's challenged, that sets me up for the rest of my life. When I see the black guy doing the perp walk on the evening news, it makes perfect sense. Black people are dangerous. So that is an idea that I digested at a very young age. And again, if I'm using my belief system to make sense of the world coming in around me, so far nothing's contradicting. I can't say, why, that guy looks like, Mr. Reynolds next door. Why, what's he being arrested? There's no conversation. Our worlds are segregated. My knowledge is so limited. So look what's on the next page. Phew, back to civilization. So this is a very old narrative in our country. Savage, civilized, savage, civilized. Now that I've gone looking, I see it through history again and again, and I see it playing out in our society today. Just a few more stereotypes. This was Joe-Jitsu. Is Joe-Jitsu. He was a cartoon character. He did all the dirty work for the Dick Tracy, who is a cartoon character, and he spoke in this horrific Chinese accent that was voiced by some white guy in a studio somewhere. It was a real mockery of an accent that I would laugh at hysterically. Again, no Chinese people in my life. This is my entire understanding of Central and South America. Speedy Gonzales and Slowpoke Rodriguez on my Saturday morning cartoons. Now, this picture is disturbing to me. I found this on the internet, and it really caused me pause because it looks so much like, for those of you who have read the book, you'll know this story. My family spent summers in northern Maine at a cabin on a lake that we had. And we would go to the dump on Saturday mornings. And my parents would have us divide the garbage into 2 piles. One was the really garbagey trash, but the other was stuff someone else might like, kind of the not so trashy trash. And part of the excitement of going to the dump for the kids was that it was our job to take the not-so-trashy trash and put it off at the perimeter of the dump. And when we pulled away, we would get to see the Indians come and take it away. So one summer, for instance, the screens, we took the screens off our screen porch because they were full of holes. The mosquitoes were getting in. My mother had us bind them very carefully and lay them off very carefully at the dump. Well, that made me feel like such a good person. I was so proud to be from a family that would take the time to roll up our screens so somebody else could have them. So now we're hearing more about my good person. I live in the best country in the world. Anyone can make it. I'm from a good family. We do generous things like this. What bothers me so much about this picture and that story is that I actually had something else in my belief system, but I did not connect the dots. Here's the other thing I had in my belief system. This is a map of Maine. The red delineations mark land grants that were given out. Late 1700s, early 1800s. My family got that land grant at the very top. I knew my family had gotten free land, which I thought was so cool. Free land? And so that meant my family had started a town. Again, so much pride, so much good feeling in me about that. But I never made the connection that those disheveled Indians, who I now know to call members of the Maliseet Nation, who were at the dump and sometimes seen wandering through town, looking terrible, that their state of being was completely connected to my family having displaced that indigenous nation years earlier. So my advantage was linked to their disadvantage. And here I was patting myself on the back for giving them my hole-filled screens. I can see why I didn't connect those dots at age 5 or age 10 or even 15. But come on. It took me till age 50 when I was at the white privilege conference and I went to a workshop called Free Land and I went, so why didn't I connect the dots? An inconvenient truth. It's just not very popular. But a reassuring lie sure is. So another major wake-up for me was the GI Bill. Again, for those of you who've read my book, I go into some detail. Also, I have a TED Talk that's 14 minutes long that goes into the GI Bill. So my father was in World War II, and he was in the Navy. And just growing up in the era I grew up in, all the men in my neighborhood and in my family, my uncles, everyone had been in World War II. And they never talked about the actual war arena, what they did as pilots or in the Navy or infantry, but they all talked about the GI Bill. And they said the GI Bill was proof positive that America took care of its own. So what the GI Bill meant was that veterans returning from World War II were able to get higher benefits, higher education for free, and a government-backed mortgage to go buy a home. My father went to Harvard Law School for free, and my parents bought their first home in Winchester, Massachusetts for $17,000 in 1945 or 46, I guess. So what really shocked me was when I learned that the 1 million, as it was put to me, the 1 million black GIs were unable to access the GI Bill. There were some exceptions, but most of the 1 million black GIs were unable to access the GI Bill. When I heard that, so much happened in my mind at once. The first thing was, there were 1 million black GIs? Where were they in my history books? Where were they in my movies? How did I not know there were 1 million black GIs? Again, history major. When I learned that, I went searching all over the internet. It wasn't very hard to find black World War II veterans. And in every photograph, I realized they were segregated troops. Black soldiers with 3 white commanders sitting in the middle. And I might be getting some of my military terminology, excuse me, messed up, but you get the picture. So think of that. We have got black Americans going to fight Hitler's racism only to be held in segregated troops and then come home and not be able to access all these benefits. So the reason they couldn't access education was at the time there were quotas at universities and colleges. There might be 2 Jewish spots, 2 black spots. Well, boom, those filled right up. There was something else going on. When my father came home from World War II, he did not have to worry about supporting his parents or my mother's parents because they were doing just fine on Social Security, a prior racialized bill. How was Social Security racialized? It excluded domestic and agricultural workers, disproportionately black and brown. So can you start to see how discrimination can happen in circuitous ways and then compound through generations? So my father's free to go get a law school education, and then my parents go to buy their home in Winchester, Massachusetts, no problem. They get to pick between all these towns and pick the one that feels best to them. They land in Winchester. Well, what I didn't know was that in 1930, in the 1930s, the Federal Housing Authority, the FHA, that was when the mortgage was designed. So before that time, people really had to buy their home pretty much outright. Maybe they could have a deal with a bank where they would pay 50 or 75% down. But the mortgage as we know it today came about in the 1930s, where you put a smaller percentage down and pay the rest over time. When the FHA designed this new financial instrument, they said to private banks, hey, private banks, you're suddenly in the business of lending to individuals who are going to go and buy homes, physical properties. So we're going to make some guidelines for you so you can know how to do these loans in a way that is investment savvy without too much risk. 2 recommendations. 1, consider the condition of a building. That makes sense, right? You don't want to invest money, lend money in a building that's about to fall apart. Number 2, the skin color of the residents. So written into FHA guidelines were the words, the presence of even 1 or 2 non-white families can undermine real estate values. So what resulted from that was hundreds of banks all over the country spreading out maps of their areas and engaging in what is called redlining. So this is Boston. Areas that were outlined in red were populated by black people. Dark green would be exclusively white people, and then the other 2 colors would be some sort of a gradation in between. I have another. I looked for one of Charlottesville. I couldn't find it. I did find one of Richmond. I'm sure there's one of Charlottesville somewhere. It wasn't online easily. I like this one of Minneapolis. I mean, I don't like it. It's horrible. But it does show the key, which I think is helpful. So A would be best, meaning best investment. Blue is still desirable. C is definitely declining. We know what definitely declining means, right? Black people are moving in and white flight spreading out to the green areas and the suburbs. And then D is hazardous investment. You think about what this means. So just to put the punctuation on that story. So the reason that a black GI could not use the housing portion of the GI Bill was that a black GI could not get a mortgage in a neighborhood that would have him. The few exceptions I have heard are black GIs who were working for universities, and the universities underwrote the GI Bill mortgage piece. Think about what this means in terms of how do we fund schools in this country, public schools? Property tax. So how do you think property values correlate to this map? Where are the property values the highest? In the green and the white areas that are outlined in green. And so those schools are over-resourced, and I would say the red schools are under-resourced. So once upon a time, if you had said to me, Debbie, picture racism and housing, I would picture the top one. But can you see that these 2 pictures are outcomes of the exact same policy? The top neighborhood got the short end of the stick. Neighborhoods like Winchester got the long end of the stick. You can't have a short end without a long end. You can't have disadvantage without advantage. Can you hear the giant sucking sound of resources being drained from that top neighborhood into the bottom? To give a sense of scale, the GI Bill pumped $120 billion from government coffers into private hands through housing, through the GI Bill. 98% of it went to white families like mine. So if you showed me the wealth divide 7 years ago, black-white wealth divide, and I realize I'm framing things very much in black and white today, and I know it's more complicated than that, but the black-white wealth divide, wealth for your average white family is 20 times that of your average black family, average net worth. I would have said, well, that's proof positive that white people work harder, they know how to save money better. Uh-oh, time to go help those poor black people. I would get into my charitable mindset. These days, I see it as an inevitable outcome of years and centuries of public and private policies and practice that divert resources towards white Americans.